Member, I yield back.
Thank you. Now let's go back to Mr. Jordan for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, for the record, if we could just run down the line here. Each of you believe that the virus started in the lab in Wuhan, China?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And each of you believe that, by definition, if it starts in the lab, it's man-made, it's engineered.
Not correct.
Okay.
It's very unlikely this was found in nature, but there is a scenario that it could have been collected in nature and then brought to a population center of 11 million, which is kind of crazy, and then accidentally leaked. It could also have been, when you say man-made, it could have been naturally evolved, which is what was suggested earlier. So it wasn't like humans putting pieces together, but allow the virus to do the virus.
Which do you think is more likely, the humans engineering it or what you just described?
I think more likely is this was, and again, this is speculation, but I think more likely it was evolved by passage either in human cells or by, quote, humanized mice to have a very virulent pathogen, at least the majority of which, and
Okay.
but it's still the same thing, okay? Whether I used a genetic tool or whether I evolved it in nature or maybe did a little bit of both, as might have been suggested, it's still a lab.
Either one of those
derived
routes is still considered gain-of-function research.
Yes. Well, yes. If you're passaging it to gain
Right.
a function, yes.
'Cause it's
Or
getting
you're
more lethal.
engineering it to gain a function,
Okay.
that's gain a
Just want to
function.
make sure we're all on the same page. And
Do we get to answers?
yeah, I saw head shakes from everyone, so
Yeah.
I'm thinking that on the first part. Yeah.
I'd like to distinguish between gain of function, which is where a virus is brought in and you could do three kinds of manipulations to it, and something I call gain of opportunity, where you do what the doctor said and go out into caves and things, and you bring them back to a population center, and they've been used to being in a vat fighting with all kinds of viruses, and now you make 1,000,000 times as many copies in one dish, and the person doing that gets a chance to get infected. So gain of opportunity is a natural virus that is in Wuhan that escapes, and then gain of function is a virus where you've played with.
But we haven't found this being a natural virus.
And,
though.
no, of course not. Of course
So.
not. It's a gain of function without any
Dr.
doubt.
Mr. Mueller?
Yeah, I would say that that the evidence that this was created by manipulation, by gene splicing, as well as gain of function, is compelling and beyond reasonable doubt. The scientific evidence is very strong, remarkably strong,
So
stronger than anything.
Do you think
I-
it's engineered? Then
engineered?
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, I have been involved in many scientific discoveries, and I have never seen such compelling evidence, even for those scientific discoveries.
that's where I was at.
in
Fine.
physics.
All right. Dr. Asher?
Just the key thing is to ask as you move toward declassification of information that needs to be seen, protecting the sources and methods, just ask how much intelligence there is on it coming out of nature.
Right.
You'll be interested in that answer.
Yeah, I think we know that. Almost rhetorical, right? If we had known it was from the lab, and as Dr. Mueller points out, engineered, I think you said earlier, Dr. Giroir, that would have helped us save lives. Is that true?
I do believe that. Two answers, whether it was engineered or not, if we would have known early and there wasn't a cover-up, we could have saved lives. Number two, if we knew it was lab-derived and they were transparent, again, I'm just hearing about the ORF7 interferon right here, but that is such a key issue,
Yeah.
which tells you if you get fever and get sick because of your interferon response, and if it was deliberately engineered to block that, not only does that become more infectious, but it means you're going to be asymptomatic.
Yeah.
That could have been a major, important finding for us to know early if that were true.
Dr. Quay, do you believe if we'd have known early, we'd have saved lives?
Yes, if again, as I said earlier, if I had the virus in 72 hours, I could have predicted all of the
Right.
transmission and asymptomatic from the virus itself. So,
Dr.
yeah, we could have.
Dr. Mueller, if we'd have known early that this was from a lab and an engineered virus, do you think that would have helped us save lives?
I have no scientific expertise on this. I have my own personal opinion, but I defer to Dr. Quay on such issues.
Okay, Dr. Asher?
key question, I think, is did we actually know and not process the data? And that's, you know, something we can fix. It's not that we can't expect the intel fairy to exist on the policymaker's desk and say, oh, what do you want to know today? But certainly at State Department, we would have liked to have known that the Chinese were working on the types of research we later learned they were, and that maybe was in the possession of our government while this was happening.
Well,
So we might have known, but didn't actually know. You understand?
you're
It's sort of a weird thing, like with pre-9/11 information.
well, I'm going to take it a little broader, but you're sort of getting to the point I wanted to make is Dr. Fauci was on notice on February 1st. Actually, take that back. He was on notice on January 31st. We got the email where one of the scientists who gets American tax dollars sent him the email and says, the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features look engineered. So the top guy on this in our government, the spokesman for the past year and a half, knew clear back on January 31st, 2020, and he also knew this sentence, we all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. So we were on notice back on January 31st, but I think the guy who had this and was on notice downplayed it and actually manufactured an article to keep the American people from knowing this.
Well, we were on notice in February of 2017 when the French government that had the most sophisticated technology employed in the world, but they gave to the Wuhan Institute, were kicked out and told the world that they thought this might be the beginning of a WMD program. So just to now that didn't mean the President of the United States or anyone really knew about it, but you know, those of us following the technology knew about it.
But that's different. That is
It's a little different, but
no, it's a lot different because this is a guy in our government who gave
Dr.
the very
Fauci
grants
should
who's
have
now
known
on
about
notice.
it too, shouldn't he? I mean, it's his counterpart in France. They were supposed to have 50 of their researchers from his French counterpart on station, and they were evicted.
Dr. Ash, let me ask you a question. Earlier today, you talked about this came from the lab, and the question is it just a leak from the lab, or is it a bioweapon? And I want you to talk to us about that, because I think the assumption for most of us has been it's a leak from the lab, but you're the one who raised the bioweapon. You brought up that term, and you've been at the State Department. I think you were at the State Department for over 25 years.
In and out.
In and out, educated at Oxford and Cornell. You know a little something about all this stuff. Tell me your answer to, was it just a lab leak or was it a bioweapon?
They were working on a program related to synthetic biology and gain of function using the serial passage evolutionary or convolutionary technology approaches. Quite publicly, actually, that they had said in their 2011 Declaration of the Biological Weapons Convention and other places, including speeches by their generals, was related to their future of warfare, of hybrid warfare. So, of course, they were working on dual-use research of concern. It's called DIRC. And the DIRC, in this case, again, if it gets out of a lab and it's not contained promptly, could result in a weapons-like release. Okay, whether they deliberately did it is, I have very little sense they did. But were they deliberately working on developing the capability to use advanced pathogenetic capabilities of war in a way that no one's seen ever employed? Yeah, they were. Of course they are. That's what the Chinese have been talking about publicly. So, I mean, there shouldn't be any surprise here. I just don't know why no one paid attention to it.
Finally, if I could, Mr. Chairman, last question is, I think earlier when I was not, had to go vote, Dr. Girard, you mentioned something about human DNA and American going to China. So I didn't catch that. Could you fill me in?
So Dr. Asher talked about export controls for biotechnology, and I know he knows this as well or better than I do, but it's not just technology, but it's information, and our genetic information is actually critical. And I do assess that the Chinese have set up circumstances that they're doing a lot of our gene sequencing of Americans that are through normal labs or even through studies at the NIH. And they're doing that for a reason, and that genetic sequences are powerful. They know our vulnerabilities. It is the first step in devising a potentially ethnic weapon, as was discussed by Dr. Asher. And similarly, I don't know if it's still the case, but I believe it is, you're not going to see any genetic sequences of Chinese exported out of the country. That was a law. There's a reason for that. And when we talk about export of technology, export of our genetic information may be the most important key that we need to stop.
Well, I want to make sure I understand this. So American genetic information is going to China. The same China that Dr. Asher talked about is doing bioweapon research with this stuff. And you're saying that combination is of particular concern.
Oh, it is an absolutely huge concern from where I sit. And again, I've been out of the formal bioweapons defense, part of the government for a period of time. But genetic information is very powerful, right? It decides who we are. It tells us about our vulnerabilities, not only disease states, but potential for genetic weapons. And what I mean by that is there are variations in receptors and other things that vary by populations, and those can potentially be exploited so that a new pathogen would differentially target a race, a European ancestry versus someone else. And we are essentially just giving all that information to China in the context of what I do believe is an unprecedented and
What's
terrifying.
the rationale for giving that to China? I mean,
Well,
I think that's a
because
fundamental question we got to ask on all this. Why are we giving all this information to China?
Because most people in the community are either naive to the threat, they deny the threat, they're oblivious to the threat, or just don't want to think about it. And that's my assessment of many of the people involved in research. It's not that they're evil, it's not they're giving it to them, but they don't just understand what is happening in China and other places.
Wow.
And we're providing this in a naive fashion across the board. And I just wanted to point out that genetic information, and again, I hope Dr. Dasher would agree with this, but genetic information is one of those things that, we should be keeping as a vital national security secret, and not providing it to adversary nations who wish to develop weapons, even openly in the literature.
If I could make a comment on this.
I'm at the mercy of the chair right now, but I'll leave it up.
Dr.
Ju-
Quay,
just
yeah,
because
absolutely.
I know exactly what he's saying, but I think I want to say it in another way. So if you go on the internet and want to do, you can do DNA tests for almost anything on the internet as a consumer, and you don't even need, a doctor to sign. And you do a scrape, you do a spit. The specimen will very often go to a laboratory here, but then it gets shipped to BGI, which Dr. Asher will say bought more Illumina sequencing machines than any place in the world, and so they will do the sequence there, and they'll send it back to the company. But guess what? They'll keep a copy, and that's what he's talking about. So every time in America, not always, but many times you will do what you think is and you'll go to a U.S. address, and then it gets shipped to BGI.
Yeah.